She was scraping burnt kernels of corn from the frozen dirt beside an abandoned wagon when the rancher saw her. And the kernels had been trampled by horses, soaked by rain, and hardened by the first touch of winter. She knew they were barely fit for animals, yet she gathered every one of them into her shaking hands because hunger had a way of changing what counted as food. Ethan Calloway reined in his horse at the edge of the road and watched her in silence. She did not hide what she was doing. She simply looked back with the quiet pride of someone who had already lost everything except the choice to keep standing. He removed his hat, something his ranch hands rarely saw him do, and spoke in a calm voice. "Ma'am, I know this isn't the right moment for questions, but I have one that might sound stranger than what you're doing." The woman waited. Her name was Clara Bennett. No, her name was Sarah Holden. She had buried her husband 6 months earlier after a fever swept through their tiny freight camp outside Laramie. Daniel Holden had been cheerful, hard-working when fortune smiled, careless when it didn't, and he had left behind little more than unpaid bills, a broken wagon, and promises that died with him. Sarah had spent every coin she owned trying to keep a rented room above the blacksmith shop in the town of Red Bluff. When the rent finally came due and there was nothing left to sell except her wedding ring, she chose to keep the ring and lose the room. She packed one worn carpet bag, wrapped herself in Daniel's oversized brown coat, and walked west because every other direction reminded her of failure. 3 days on the road had emptied her stomach and nearly emptied her hope. She had not cried once. She refused to give misery that victory. Now she stood in the cold gathering ruined corn from the ground because her body had reached the point where pride could no longer fill an empty stomach. Ethan stepped closer but kept enough distance to show respect. He was 36, broad-shouldered, weathered by years of Wyoming wind, and owner of the largest cattle ranch in the Red Bluff Valley. People imagined that owning thousands of acres made a man comfortable. They never counted the endless repairs, the unpaid notes, the sick cattle, or the responsibility of feeding 16 cowboys before daylight every morning. His cook had ridden away without warning 5 days before the autumn roundup, leaving behind an organized pantry and complete chaos. Ethan had tried cooking for his men himself. After 4 miserable suppers, even the ranch dogs had started looking disappointed. He had spent 2 days searching every nearby settlement for help and found none. Then on his ride home, he found a starving widow picking food from the mud. Fate had placed 2 desperate people on the same stretch of road. He finally asked, "Can you cook?" Sarah blinked, almost believing she had heard him wrong. Out of every question in the world, that was the last one she expected. Ethan continued before she could answer. "I need someone who knows a kitchen better than I ever will. I'll pay honest wages. You'll have your own room, warm meals, and no one will ask why I found you here unless you choose to tell them." Sarah slowly opened her hand and watched the ruined kernels fall back onto the ground. She lifted her chin. "I've been cooking since I was old enough to reach a stove," she answered quietly. "Then come with me," Ethan said without another question. "The ranch needs someone who knows how to feed hardworking people." Her legs trembled from exhaustion as she reached for the saddle. Ethan offered his hand without pity, only respect. She accepted it because survival sometimes meant accepting kindness before pride had time to object. The ride to the Calloway Ranch took nearly 2 hours. As they climbed the final ridge, Sarah saw smoke rising from a large ranch house surrounded by barns, corrals, bunkhouses, and hundreds of grazing cattle stretching across the valley. Only that morning she had wondered whether she would survive another night. Now she stared at a place full of life, work, and possibility. She silently promised herself that if this ranch offered her one chance, she would earn every inch of it. Welcome to Broken Saddle Stories, where forgotten women, honorable ranchers, and second chances become legends beneath the wide western sky. If you enjoy heartfelt western romances filled with courage, loyalty, and hope, stay with us because this journey is only beginning. The ranch kitchen was larger than any Sarah had ever seen, but it looked as though a storm had passed through it. Dirty pots crowded every surface. Flour sacks sat open beside scattered beans. Dried herbs had been tossed wherever someone found space. A cast iron stove still held the ashes of a poorly managed fire. Sarah stepped inside and for the first time in months felt something awaken deep within her. She belonged in a kitchen. She always had. Without wasting a second, she rolled up her sleeves, tied back her hair, cleaned the stove, sorted every shelf, inspected the pantry, and planned supper before Ethan finished showing her where the water pump stood. He watched quietly from the doorway until she finally turned toward him. "Mr. Calloway," she said with calm confidence, "if you truly want these men fed properly tonight, you'll have to leave this kitchen to me." Ethan gave a small nod, the faintest smile touching his face before he disappeared outside. Sarah stood alone beside the stove, placed both hands on the wooden table, and whispered to herself, "This is where my life begins again." Before sunrise the next morning, the ranch kitchen was already alive with the crackling sound of oak logs burning beneath the cast iron stove. Sarah Holden had been awake for nearly 2 hours kneading biscuit dough while thick strips of salt pork sizzled in a heavy skillet. Fresh coffee filled the room with its rich aroma, and 2 large kettles of gravy simmered gently beside a pot of oats. By the time the first cowboy pushed open the kitchen door, breakfast was waiting exactly as though it had always been that way. The men stopped talking the moment they saw the table. One by one, they filled their plates, expecting another disappointing meal like the ones Ethan had struggled through the previous week. Instead, they tasted buttery biscuits, creamy gravy, crisp pork, fried potatoes, and hot coffee strong enough to chase away the Wyoming morning chill. No one spoke for nearly 10 minutes because every man was too busy eating. Finally, Gabe Mercer, the gray-bearded trail boss who had spent over 30 years working cattle, leaned back with a satisfied breath. "Ma'am," he said, "I've ridden across 5 territories and eaten on more ranches than I can count. This is the finest breakfast I've had in years." Sarah simply smiled and poured another cup of coffee into his tin mug. Praise had never mattered as much to her as seeing empty plates. Ethan sat quietly at the head of the table, watching 16 hungry men finish every crumb. For the first time since the cook had left, the morning began without complaints. Before the riders headed toward the autumn roundup, each man packed a cloth bundle Sarah had prepared with thick sandwiches, dried apples, smoked beef, and fresh biscuits. The workday stretched from sunrise until darkness, but nobody returned hungry enough to grumble. By the 4th day, the entire rhythm of the Calloway Ranch had changed. Cowboys worked longer without losing strength. Horses were saddled earlier because breakfast was always ready on time. Arguments that normally filled the bunkhouse after exhausting days became quiet conversations over satisfying suppers. Ethan noticed everything, even if he said very little. One evening, after the men had drifted toward the bunkhouse, he remained at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee while Sarah wiped down the counters. "You've changed this place in less than a week," he said. She shook her head. "I only cook meals." Ethan looked around the warm kitchen before answering. "No, Mrs. Holden, you gave tired men something to look forward to every day. That changes how they work." Sarah paused with the dish towel still in her hands. She understood exactly what he meant because her own father had once told her that a ranch survived on 2 things: good horses and a dependable kitchen. "People work harder when someone cares whether they eat well," she replied softly. Ethan nodded. "My late wife believed the same thing." The words settled gently between them. Sarah offered no hurried sympathy. She simply respected the silence. After a long moment, Ethan continued. "Emily passed away almost 5 years ago. Since then, this house has never quite felt alive." Sarah looked toward the glowing stove. "Sometimes a house doesn't need new walls," she said quietly. "Sometimes it only needs warmth again." Ethan looked at her differently after that. Not with pity and not with obligation, but with growing respect. Still, they continued calling each other Mr. Calloway and Mrs. Holden. Neither wished to cross a line that did not yet belong to them. Days turned into weeks as autumn painted the valley gold and crimson. Sarah learned every corner of the ranch while never forgetting why she had come. She wasn't a guest. She was earning her place. Then one cold afternoon trouble arrived. A young cowboy named Ben Carter was thrown from a frightened horse while repairing a fence near the north pasture. The men carried him back with his right arm hanging unnaturally against his side. Ethan had ridden to inspect the western range, leaving Gabe in charge. "Ride for the doctor," one cowboy shouted. Gabe shook his head grimly. "Nearest doctor's nearly a day's ride. Ben won't last that long with his shoulder like that." Sarah stepped forward. Years earlier, she had watched a traveling physician treat freight workers injured along the trail while caring for her late husband. She had never forgotten what she learned. She washed her hands, studied Ben's shoulder carefully, then knelt beside him. "Listen to me," she said calmly. "This will hurt worse than anything you've ever felt, but only for a second." Ben clenched his jaw and nodded. Sarah positioned his arm exactly as she remembered, took one steady breath, and with one swift movement guided the shoulder back into place. A loud pop echoed through the kitchen. Ben cried out once before collapsing backward with relief flooding across his face. His breathing steadied almost immediately. Sarah wrapped the shoulder tightly with clean cloth and instructed him not to move it for several days. By sunset, Ethan returned to find Ben sitting comfortably at the kitchen table eating beef stew with one hand. Gabe met him outside. "Mrs. Holden saved the boy," the old trail boss said simply. Ethan entered the kitchen and looked from Ben to Sarah without speaking. Finally, he asked, "Where did you learn that?" Sarah stirred the stew before answering. "Freight camps teach lessons no one hopes to need." Ethan gave a slow nod. "Seems you know more than cooking." She offered a faint smile. "Life teaches different recipes to different people." That evening, they shared coffee after supper as they often did now. The conversation came easier than before, and neither seemed eager to leave the quiet warmth of the kitchen. Outside, the Wyoming wind carried the first promise of winter across the dark valley. Inside, neither of them realized that the greatest challenge facing the Callaway Ranch had not yet arrived. It was already riding toward them from town, carrying legal papers, unpaid debts, and a man who believed the ranch would soon belong to him. The first real snow arrived 3 days later, covering the Callaway Ranch in white before sunrise. Every fence post, rooftop, and cedar tree disappeared beneath a blanket of ice. But inside the ranch house, the kitchen remained warm, bright, and full of life. Sarah Holden was already preparing breakfast when heavy boots crossed the porch. The knock on the front door was sharp and impatient. The kind of knock made by a man who believed every door would eventually belong to him. Ethan opened it and found a well-dressed stranger standing beside a black horse. His name was Victor Ashcroft, a wealthy investor from Cheyenne who had quietly purchased the remaining debt on the Callaway Ranch months earlier. The dry summer had hurt cattle prices, and Ethan had borrowed money to keep the ranch running. Victor had never intended to collect payments. He wanted the land. "Morning, Mr. Callaway," Victor said with a cold smile. "I thought I'd stop by before winter settles in. I imagine paying that note won't be easy this season." Ethan folded his arms. "We're managing." "Are you?" Victor stepped inside without waiting for permission and glanced around the busy kitchen. "I've already spoken with buyers interested in this property. I'd hate for you to lose everything because of one difficult winter." Sarah remained at the stove, saying nothing, but she listened carefully to every word. Victor assumed she was only the cook. He never imagined she understood numbers as well as recipes. Years of helping her late husband manage freight accounts had taught her that every dollar had a place, and every mistake left a trail. After Victor finally rode away, Ethan sat quietly at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of ledgers. Sarah poured him fresh coffee before speaking. "May I see the books?" Ethan looked surprised. "These aren't kitchen accounts." "I know. They're complicated." Sarah met his eyes without hesitation. "So is feeding 16 hungry men through a Wyoming winter." "Let me look." For a long moment he considered refusing. Instead, he slid the ledgers across the table. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon reading every page. By evening, she found something Ethan had overlooked. Several supply contracts were draining the ranch because they had never been renegotiated after cattle prices dropped. Expensive shipments were arriving from distant merchants when the same goods could be purchased locally for much less. She also noticed dozens of barrels of preserved apples, dried beans, smoked meat, and flour stored in barns that had never been fully inventoried. "You've been buying food you already own," she said quietly. Ethan frowned. "That's impossible." She turned the ledger toward him. "Not impossible, just unnoticed." Together, they worked late into the night comparing receipts with storage records. By midnight, Sarah had reduced nearly a quarter of the ranch's winter expenses without cutting a single meal. Ethan leaned back, rubbing tired eyes. "You may have just saved this ranch." Sarah smiled gently. "Sometimes survival isn't about earning more. Sometimes it's about wasting less." Over the following weeks, the changes spread across the operation. Supplies were organized, spending became careful, nothing useful was thrown away. Sarah even taught the ranch hands how to preserve vegetables, smoke extra meat, and stretch every harvest through winter. The kitchen became the heart of the ranch, and before long, every part of the operation beat in time with it. When the payment date finally arrived, Victor Ashcroft returned expecting to claim the property. Instead, Ethan calmly handed him the full amount owed. Victor counted the money twice before looking up in disbelief. "I don't understand," he admitted. Ethan smiled for the first time that morning. "You underestimated the people keeping this ranch alive." Victor mounted his horse without another word and rode away, leaving the Callaway ranch exactly as he had found it. Except now it belonged completely to Ethan once again. That evening, the ranch hands gathered inside the bunkhouse for the first celebration they'd enjoyed in years. Laughter echoed across the snowy yard, while Sarah quietly washed the last supper plate. Ethan entered the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Everyone's looking for you," he said. She smiled. "They don't need me for celebrating." "Maybe not." He placed 1 mug beside her. "But I do." Sarah looked at him uncertain. Ethan removed his hat just as he had the day they first met beside the abandoned wagon. "The day I found you," he said softly, "I thought I was hiring a cook. Turns out I was welcoming the person who saved my ranch and reminded this house how to feel like a home again." Sarah lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "The day you found me, I believe my life was already over." Ethan gently reached for her hand. "Looks to me like it was only beginning." She smiled through tears she no longer felt ashamed to show. Outside, snow continued falling across the valley, but inside the old ranch house there was warmth, laughter, and the quiet promise of a future neither of them had expected to find. Some people survive because they are strong. Others become strong because someone offers them one chance at exactly the right moment. Sarah Holden had arrived carrying nothing except her courage and the gift of feeding hungry people. By the time winter settled over the valley, the entire Callaway ranch depended on her, not only for meals, but for hope itself. And in saving a ranch that everyone believed was destined to fail, she found something she thought she had buried forever: a family, a home, and a second chance at love. That is how legends are born beneath the endless western sky, where kindness can change a life as surely as any six-shooter, and where the smallest act of compassion can build a future strong enough to outlast the hardest winter.